The time has come to experience terror at Collinwood, and I'm very excited to get to today's episode featuring Jeff Owens of the Classic Horrors Club podcast and Steven Turek of the DieCast Movie Podcast, and we're going to discuss the monsters of Dark Shadows. But before we get to that, I have some exciting news and update on the Dark Shadows Remembrance Weekend. It's happening July 5th and 6th in Burbank at the Los Angeles Marriott Burbank Airport Hotel. Special guests include David Selby, Catherine Lee Scott, Nancy Barrett, Jerry Lacey, James Storm, Lisa Richards, and Roger Davis. I know Marie Wallace will be zooming in from New York. There may be some other cast members who are going to be participating via Zoom. This is not a convention, however. It's not a festival. This is a celebration of life for Lara Parker on Friday, July 5th, and that's free admission. The Saturday event is a little more festival-esque, maybe. Not exactly, but there are some elements there that are reminiscent, I suppose. That's going to be Saturday, July 6th. That one is by reservation only, and it's going to be honoring Jonathan Frid's centenary. There's going to be a luncheon. There's going to be some memorabilia there. There's going to be a Reader's Theater entertainment with David Selby, Journey Within the Shadows, a Jonathan Frid memoir, Q&A plus autographs with guests, a charity auction, a screening of Dark Shadows and Beyond, the Jonathan Frid story, and during the celebration of life of Lara Parker, Remembering Lara Parker video retrospective and guest speakers, music performance by James Storm, and movie screening Night of Dark Shadows with some long-lost Lara Parker footage. To register, reservations for the Saturday event is $60 per person and must be made in advance online via Eventbrite, and I will put a link to that in the show notes. There's also a Friday trip to Collinwood from the 1991 series, The Greystone Mansion. For details, you can email dsweekendjuly2024@gmail.com, and you can get a special discount on the hotel at the Marriott Burbank. I'll put a link to the hotel also in the show notes, but the rooms keep selling out. Tickets are going very fast from what I understand, and rooms, they keep adding blocks of rooms, and even if it sells out though, there are going to be other options available that they will announce. Keep an eye on the Jonathan Frid documentary Facebook page if you're on Facebook, or the Dark Shadows news page. Also on the main page of the terror@collinwood.com website, I have a link that goes directly to the blog, which has all of the information there in one place, so you can click through on the links there. So very exciting. Again, this is not a festival, but we haven't had any kind of gathering like this of the actors from the show in a long time, and if I hear anything else, I'll announce it in the future. I'm really excited. I will be there, so I look forward to seeing you there. I'll bring some Terror at Collinwood stickers with me on Saturday, and if you want a sticker, just come over and say hi, and I'll give you one until I run out. Also, the Rondo Hatton Classic Horror Awards voting is still going on. That's going to be happening until April 16th. You can vote up until April 16th, 2024. You can send your votes to taraco@aol.com, TARACO@aol.com. You can listen to the episode I did with Catherine Lee Scott. At the top of that episode, I listed all of the podcast guests who have been nominated for a Rondo Award this year, so get to voting if you would like to vote. Just send your choices in. Do it by April 16th. Last thing, I apologize in advance. My voice in this episode sounds terrible. You can tell I'm still a little stuffy. I got sick again. My voice sounded even worse in the episode, so I do apologize for that. But luckily, I had two amazing podcasters on the show with me who definitely helped carry the load, so thanks to Jeff and Steven. And now, let's hear what they have to say. That glisten. There are spoilers here for those who listen. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am Penny Dreadful, aka Danielle, and I have been cursed. Clearly, once again, I am sick. I must call Dr. Bombay. Dr. Bombay, come right away. Third time I've been sick since December, which is crazy. But luckily, I am joined by two pro podcasters today who are going to help carry the load here in this episode, which I sincerely appreciate. I am joined by podcaster, writer, and blogger Jeff Owens, who is the co-host of the Classic Horrors Club podcast, which he hosts alongside Rich Chamberlain. They discuss movies from silent screen to Halloween and everything scary in between. Jeff's Classic Horrors Club website features analysis and discussion about many different films. Podcaster Steven Turek is the host of the DieCast Movie Podcast, which features reviews, interviews, and discussions about films that are picked via the roll of a die. Steven also fills in as guest host for Derek M. Cook on Monster Kid Radio. Welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks
for having
you. I
us.
am truly honored to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Oh my goodness, it's my pleasure. I am honored to have you both here. I've been wanting to bring you both on for some time now, as I know you're both Dark Shadows fans and you both have really great podcasts that I very much enjoy. I encourage fans to go vote in the Rondo Awards for, I don't think you can vote for two, but flip a coin, roll a die and pick
There you go.
Classic Horrors Club podcast or DieCast Movie Podcast. Really great shows. And you guys, for the video version of this episode, both of these guys are at the old house. One is inside the old house and the other one's outside the old house. So we're hanging out here in Collinsport, which I love. This is awesome. So how's it going, guys? How you doing?
Well, Jeff has connections. That's why he got inside. I don't have those kind of connections, so that's why I'm on the outside. Jeff is way more the Dark Shadows expert than I am, so that's why I'm somewhere lurking on the ground, at dusk, so I can sneak around before I get caught and like thrown out off the property. But Jeff, he's such a Dark Shadows fan. They let him roam the insides.
Well, I love Dark Shadows. I hesitate. I'm a little bit nervous because I don't know all the inners and outers. It's been a long time since I've watched different sections of the show. And so as long as we keep it to wide sweeping comments, I think I'll do okay.
Oh, you guys are going to be amazing. I'm so happy to have you both here. So Willie Loomis let you into the old house. He's filling in for Willie tonight. Willie's down at the Blue Whale, so Jeff's filling in.
We just have to be done by sun, so Barnabas doesn't get me.
Yes.
And Danielle, one thing I want to add also, your podcast is also nominated for the Rondos and is, should definitely get, votes and things like that. So it's
thank you, Steven. Well, yeah, lots of good stuff on there. Monster Kid Radio is on there too. So definitely make sure to vote, regardless of who you vote for. Make sure you do vote in the Rondo Awards. I think it ends April 16th. Is when the voting ends? It's around there. I think it's somewhere in
around tax day. Yeah,
around tax day.
I'll let you two duke it out. While I would love to have a write-in vote, we weren't actually nominated. So
what?
Yeah. So
how did that happen? You guys have been on the ballot like the last couple of years.
Yeah, we have. I don't know.
I think that might have just been an oversight or something. That's really weird. Well, but you can write in Classic Horrors Club.
Right.
So there you go.
Also write for Jeff in the writer category.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that's right. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jeff?
Sure. So when I lived in Kansas City, I was officially a film critic in the Kansas City Film Critic Circle and had a lot of opportunities then to start writing. So I've had things featured in We Belong Dead magazine and then their series of books. Euro Horror was the most recent one that came out. And then I had the opportunity in the last couple of years to write for Scary Monsters, which is really a treat to do that. So you can find me in different places. Oh, and I don't know if we'll mention it, but I'll actually be in the new edition of Daytime Gothic.
Oh, well, great. Very cool.
So I consider myself first and foremost a writer. And if you listen to the podcast, you would probably agree.
What are you? Well, you're great podcaster and great writer too. You do some really great write-ups about movies on your blog as well, which I will link to in the show notes. What are you writing for Daytime Gothic?
It is a little bit of, I guess, my beginnings with Dark Shadows. I talk about watching it as a child and how it scared me. And if I know sometimes you ask people what was their beginnings with Dark Shadows.
And I was going to ask you, yeah.
Yes, I'll have to be a little vague because a lot of that is revealed in that article. And I think it's kind of fun. So I was real glad to have that opportunity. I missed the first edition. I wasn't quick enough to express interest. So I'm glad to be in this one.
Fantastic. And let's ask Steven here. How did you first discover Dark Shadows? Because you've been a monster kid your whole life. You've always been into these films. So how did Dark Shadows fit into that?
Like a lot of things in my life, whether it's movies, TV shows, and that kind of stuff, a lot of it when I was growing up was from my eldest brother, who's 8 years older. So, of course, when you have a brother who's 8 years older and another one that's 4 years older, you just want to follow around with they're the cool ones. So you want to do whatever the older cool brother is doing. My middle brother's not as cool, and he's not going to listen to this. So I can say that. So I feel relatively safe. So Rick was old enough when Dark Shadows was out initially. He was able to see it, when he was younger. And he enjoyed it a lot. Of course, he enjoyed the werewolf and the vampire, all that kind of stuff. So when it came back out in syndication in some of the areas where we were living at, he would say, "Oh, we got to watch this." And so I knew from word of mouth it was good, and then I saw it then. And then I saw for like a year. I think I was able to see some of the episodes. So I only got kind of sampling, and I wasn't really able to get fully into Dark Shadows until several years ago. I bought the Coffin collection, which I know a lot of people have gotten, and I got it's right there background. Yeah, and it's if you happen to have it, it's a lovely thing because one, it's a great display piece, and then when you open it up, it's even more of a great display piece. You get to see Barnabas there and resided inside of it. And I don't know why I did it this way, but I decided to just watch all the Dark Shadows episodes in a short succession. So I did it within like 3 months.
Wow.
Just doing it. Now, the nature of the job I work at, I'm able to actually it's not playing in the background. I'm able to actively watch the episodes, and they're only like 20 minutes each. And when I did that, I didn't watch any on the weekends because I wanted to give myself a break. So I was only watching them Mondays through Fridays in the 3-month period. And I would watch a couple episodes before I went to work. Then I would go to work, and then for 6 hours, I'd be watching Dark Shadows episodes. And then if a storyline was leaving on a cliffhanger, which it notoriously would, I would go home and I would sometimes watch another episode or 2 or 3 just to get through it, to get an idea of what was happening there. And the Dark Shadows is so addictive, being a soap opera and how everything was set up, that it's like the crack of soap operas for me. It's just once you start, you can't stop, and you had to go through all the way to the end, which you can say the bitter end because it ends and it doesn't continue on. And so, yeah, it was fun. It was an enjoyable ride. And I really think it was an interesting way to do it. And that's how Jeff and I got together one thing, because I was posting on Facebook as I was going through this. I would put like a little thing like, "Oh, yeah, like a better week or so, I'd put, this is what's been happening as I was doing the Dark Shadows run." And that kind of thing. So it was interesting. And then I was on the Classic Cars Club show when they were talking about Dark Shadows. Jeff and Rich had me on because I was the crazy guy that did it in 3 months. I'm sure there's people that have done it quicker. I mean, you could do it quicker if you did it on weekends.
Yeah, that was a fun time. We were kind of monitoring his progress, and I still don't really believe that he did that. That's amazing.
Yeah, Patrick McRae did something similar, and he even scheduled like meal breaks and everything so that he could get through. I think he did it in a month, a little over a month. I think it was insane. Like he just like plowed through it. I know you want to save the details for the Daytime Gothic issue too, which is going to be packed with a lot of great stuff. But Jeff, could you briefly maybe give us a little taste of how you got into Dark Shadow?
Sure. So I am literally that kid that ran home from after school. I mean, I really, really did. And I remember going home. I remember the route I took. And the first episodes I remember are Werewolf. And part of what I do in my article is I investigated and tried to pinpoint exactly what episode it was and when that was. And I think I did it. But about the same time, there was the Barnabas Collins coffin game that I wanted for Christmas and found it under the tree. House of Dark Shadows came out in our local theater in Enid, Oklahoma. I write about my experience seeing that. I did not last my first viewing of that. I was a little frightened. So I left, but like with most things, I kind of time passed and went to school. I had another life, and actually, when I graduated from college and I lived in Oklahoma City for a year, one weekend I was out at a used bookstore and I found some of the novels, the Marilyn Ross novels, and that's actually what got me back into it. So I didn't watch much of the sci-fi run, but I started collecting the VHS tapes. I actually worked for a video company at the time and knew a rep at MPI, and I
Oh,
sometimes got a good deal, sometimes didn't, but I eventually had to stop. That was just too much, and I eventually sold them, I'm sure, for a dime. But then got the coffin set and been pretty I guess active or interested in it, ever since then. One last thing, I did go to the festival when it was in LA the year of the revival series on NBC. So got to meet cast old
oh,
and new, and
cool.
that was a highlight for me.
Was the Dark Shadows Festival?
Yes.
Did Dark Shadows sort of dovetail nicely into your Monster Kid interests at that time in terms of the films and stuff that you were into, or was it distinct for you, or was it part of that?
It was part. Here's a great answer. It was both part
Uh-huh.
of it and yet distinct. I think I would reference it many, many times when I was writing about other things, and
Mhm.
was always there. And I'll drop references in the podcast about it. So it was influential, I will say, and it sort of looms large over nearly everything else.
It does, and it had such an influence too on a lot of subsequent horror media as well. Particularly where you have the vampire as a protagonist, these types of things that you have seen, like Forever Night or Angel and things like that. Interview with the Vampire and things like that. It had a big impact, and it doesn't get enough credit. I say this on the podcast all the time, but I feel Dark Shadows doesn't get the credit it deserves sometimes for the impact that it had, and I don't know why. I don't know if it's because people didn't take it as seriously because it was a daytime show, or it just kind of fell off the map for some people. Do you guys have any theories on that or thoughts on that, or do you disagree with that? I'm
Why
curious
it
to hear that.
ended, because I think in my opinion, they rushed through a lot of storylines.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Some of them were extended longer, but some of them, like, which we'll get to when we talk about the monster ones more detail. But Adam, I thought, was a storyline that could have gone for a lot longer and had more twists and turns and add-ons to it. And it just seemed to end a lot sooner than I was expecting. But it seems like, but it all depends on the writers. If you're able to come up with good storylines, and of course the grind being every day, it's hard to do that pace. So it's hard for me to say what happened, why it went this way or that way. But I think it definitely had a rate decline. I think it could have been like the Batman TV show. It hit its moment, spiked, and then went down. And part of me is not upset that it ended, because I think it adds more timeless quality to it, that it has a definitive length of time of, was about 5 years
Yeah, yeah.
of going through. And I think that makes it nicer, where if it would have continued on for 20, 25 years, well, one, it would be, the coffin case would be the size of a real coffin. It would be huge. So I'm glad that so part of me is like, it ended, and it seemed to end on a solid note. And you had a lot of the cast that was still there, because if it would have continued on for 15, 20 years, who knows? There's always a few that would be there the whole time, but
Yeah.
most of the ones that we are so endeared to would have been recast and done, and then who has happened in the show anyway in the 5 year period. But you can only imagine if it would have been extended. So
Good
I
point.
think it was I think it adds that extra quality because it has that finite period of time.
Jeff, any thoughts?
Yeah, as far as it like still being popular and today, I know there's such a rabid fan base, it seems like. And when things do come along, the revival or the failed CW pilot or something, the fan base gets excited. But I think it needs something, a injection of something to bring it back and make it bigger than that. And, I don't know the latest on Mark Perry's show, but that I sure hope that makes it.
Yeah, I haven't
'Cause
heard anything
that could
new.
be it. And then we need the merchandising, we need the Funko Pops and all of that stuff to just kind of, even if it just raises awareness of it, what was it? And so
Agreed.
Do you guys think that it could have died out around the time it did? Because that was pretty much when Gothic horror was also at the end of it was on its last embers in the movie theaters. So it could just be like everybody was just moving away from that because the new horror was coming. And maybe Dark Shadows could have continued if it would have left its Gothic roots and it would have embraced the newer stuff. But then it wouldn't be Dark Shadows anymore.
Exactly.
That's why
Yeah.
I'm glad it ended where it did, because it's, like I said, it keeps it Gothic. But I think, as you were talking about, why did it end where it did? I think it was a lot because of it seemed every audiences were heading away from the Gothic.
I think
yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Hammer's a perfect example. How they, everyone was trying to figure it out in the 70s to try to survive, and there was just that new blood coming through that it would never be the same.
Yeah. Emphasis on blood, because it was becoming more lurid in I always call the 70s monster craze as opposed to the 60s monster craze, because there were still plenty of monsters around in the 70s, but it was much more lurid and much more bloody, and Hammer was trying to keep up with what they were doing in the States with a lot of those movies. So Dark Shadows was more of a throwback to the classic Gothic style of those films of the 30s and early Hammer films as well. So I think there was still Gothic stuff in the 70s, but it was much more rated R kind of stuff.
Well, I was going to say, Steve, it was on network television, so they couldn't do the nudity that probably would have propelled it into superstar status.
Yeah.
Or the blood, but I mean, even Dan Curtis kind of knew it, because the first film that they did really embraced the blood, and it was also more. It was Gothic, but it was more modern. Like they changed the thing up, and I think so. If he would have had his ability to do it off network or whatever, I think that's the direction he knew everything was heading, and would have embraced it even more. And I wish they would have done more than the two movies and before the anthology type series with different stories utilizing a different cast. That's just a shame that it stopped at two. It would have been so cool to have seen what he could have done in a 10-year period with a lot of the cast, and interjecting some other people into it, and where it could have went. It would have been really decent, really cool.
Yeah. There was supposedly a third movie that they talked about, but it never happened. Unfortunately, with Night of Dark Shadows, MGM made Curtis cut so much of the film out that it was. I still love Night of Dark Shadows, but it's difficult to follow sometimes because it's missing so much of the film. But I think as far as the show, I don't think it could have continued on because Dan Curtis was done. He wanted to go make movies. Jonathan Frid seemed like he was done too. I think there was it was like you said, burn brightly, because I think there was a burnout factor too, because they were churning those out every day, these episodes, and there were special effects and these elaborate plot lines, and must have taken quite a toll on everybody involved. So I think 5 years is good. I would have liked one more year, or at least another 6 months or so, where we come back to the present and really wrap it up with the characters that we followed the whole time, because ending it in 1841 parallel time was kind of a weird place to end the show. But it also leaves it open-ended for what's going on in the main time band too, because it's like, well, things were resolved here, but what's happening in our time band? So maybe that also stimulates the imaginations of the fans, like, oh, what could still come in that world? So it might have been both a blessing and a curse to end that when it did.
Well, I think by doing that, it also left things open for novels, the comic books,
Yeah.
and like Big Finish doing their things. And those things are always going to be hit and miss depending on the creative teams that are involved, and also depending on what everybody's individual tastes are, and so on. But it does leave open for people to play in that playground still.
Absolutely.
And it's wide open. I mean, they've already established different parallel time, future, past. I mean, any story basically is up for grabs if somebody wants to do something creative with Dark Shadows.
Yes.
And forget about the Marvel multiverse. It's the Dark Shadow verse.
There you go.
Yeah. And I mean, as long as they remain true to the characters, I think
Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but it does seem like that the series stuck pretty true to the characters from beginning to end. I know I
Yes.
was watching some of the later episodes recently, and it just seemed like, oh, that was way at the beginning. They established that. So I kind of, I don't know, I just forgot that they did really stick with that.
Yeah. I think some of the characters developed and became more sympathetic or complex over time, but still remain true to who they were consistent, even if they became more multifaceted or more sympathetic. Um, you start to see different sides of them, like Roger, for example, like early Roger. He's a jerk, you know. He's not but he's very charming, but he's a jerk. But you start to see more once that plot line with the Burke Devlin revenge plot gets sort of resolved. It's like a weight lifts off Roger's shoulders, and he becomes a better father to David. He's still arrogant and drinking his brandy and making wry comments, which we love to see, but he's more likable. And or David himself. We're going to talk about monsters in just a bit, but Steven brought up David the other day. I'm like, you could argue that for sure early on. So with that said, I brought these guys on here because who better to talk about the monsters of Dark Shadows with than Jeff and Steven? So, Dark Shadows, of course, incorporated many classic archetypes into the tapestry that it created, pulling stories and characters or analogs for characters into the mix, and presenting them in a new way, or in a familiar way, but through the lens of Dark Shadows. And when I say I think Dark Shadows could have kept going at least another year, they could have done a few more Gothic tales. There were plenty more they could have kept going with. But I want to talk about some of our favorite monsters of Dark Shadows, and why you like them. And I kind of broke it down into some different categories here. I do apologize for my voice. I'm going to try to keep my talking to a minimum here and hear what Jeff and Steven have to say about these characters. But I guess since I mentioned David, do we consider the human characters to be monsters? Or is Dave? Because David, I think, has a lot of similarities. He's like a male version of Rhoda from the Bad Seed. Early on, he's really, really manipulative, incipient psychopath, as Roger calls him, and kind of scary. But there are other characters like that who are human characters who are very troubled, or Reverend Trask, Gregory Trask in 1897. He's pretty bad. I mean, do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm sure Steve does, and you've opened a can of worms, Danielle, because Steve always asks the question, what is a monster? And do you consider human? Don't ask him if he thinks Norman Bates is a monster or not, okay?
But no, actually, Jeff, it's interesting. I brought her up that David, to me, in the Dark Shadows universe, is probably the most monstrous character. Now, I'm using the word monstrous character instead of monster, as Jeff alluded to, because what is a monster? But if I remember, didn't he try to cut like the brake wire? Didn't he cut like the brake?
The bleeder valve.
The bleeder valve, yeah. In Roger's car. He tried to murder his father.
And as you said, with like Rhonda being that way, he was set up to be that character. So to me, he was the most evil character for a while in that series. Because we're starting off, it's the Gothic, but there's no real typical we would consider a normal monster. It's the evil deeds that people are doing, and his was the one I think that were the worst, because you're not expecting it from the young child who has Victoria Winters coming to take care of him, pure as ivory snow, and here you got this evil child who's just who is he evil because he's that way, or is it because of the way he was brought up? And the subject of his environment, is it because he wants attention? I mean, there's so many factors that you could break down this character. You could do a whole episode just on David's psychology. But I hated David. I mean, I hated David as a character pretty much all the way through the series. I mean, there was times he was less of a jerk and he was the one they were trying to save, but really, nobody, I don't think, would have really shed a tear if David would have died anywhere during the series. I mean, they might have said, "Oh, we were set." Nobody was really like, "Oh, I'm a big David fan." to my knowledge. I don't know if there was a big fan club because it was just the way the character was written and played so well. I just enjoy how malicious he is, and I think that to start off the series, he is the most evil character. I mean, Roger's number 2, but he is by far outpaces his dad.
Yeah, he was definitely on my list. I'm a little more generous in my definition of a monster, and I definitely think he was a monster. It's interesting though. I mean, how he's not a monster for all that long. I mean, he sort of evolves and becomes the, well, as kids watching Dark Shadows, I'm sure I identified with him probably. I just, I don't know if you talk about storylines Dark Shadows never did, and maybe if he had been introduced later, I could just see a storyline where David is, well, I guess he did get possessed from time to time, but maybe a Village of the Damned type thing where, there was a reason he was a monster, and so they have to try to save him.
And we could make an argument because he's not fully human.
He's half Phoenix.
He's half Phoenix. So in a sense, he's not a typical person, so he's a hybrid. So he is, yes, I would say going by my definition, as a person, he's not really a person because he's in both worlds. So yes, I would say he definitely classifies as a monster, as we find out later, as the storylines go and things like that. But I also appreciate that he has the thing where the Josette, the ghost, he's like connected to the spirit world. Is that because he's half Phoenix and he has that extra connection, so he's able to pick up on that earlier than everybody else? Is it because of his youth? There's lots of nuances there. Like I said, you could spend the whole episode just on David.
I think he did have an affinity for the supernatural. It always seemed to find him. And he does become more sympathetic, I think, after the experience he has with Laura, after the Phoenix goes up in flames and he makes the choice to go to Vicky instead. David's trajectory as a character changes. Something happened. He still could be a real jerk as the show goes on, but not to that degree where he's like locking Vicky in a room by herself to die. So you mentioned ghosts, Josette's ghost. So I want to talk, what are some of your favorite ghosts in the series? That was technically the first supernatural monster in the show, was a ghost. I guess if you call Josette, well, I don't know if you would call Josette a monster, I guess, but she's a ghost. She's a supernatural being. So do you have any thoughts on favorite ghosts in the show?
Do you want to go first, Jeff?
No. Go ahead. I will say ghosts are probably my least favorite of any of the archetypes or monsters that we're going to talk about. And I think maybe they were overused a bit. I mean, how do you pick? There's so many. And yeah, some played more important part to the story. But I'm not sure. Let me think about that.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate Josette. I enjoyed it because it was starting it down the supernatural path. Because now we're heading there. We have something tangible we can see. It's a ghost, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then of course they kept the storyline going because they introduced the widows, and they introduced the problems that it's causing to some characters where it could be helpful or hurtful. In the case of Josette, she was a good spirit. So just because somebody's a monster doesn't mean they're evil. For instance, depending on which Godzilla film you watch, he's a monster in both, but he could be on the side of good or on the side of destruction.
Yeah.
But he's still a monster. So a ghost can be a monster, but it could be a monster that's on your side, is the way I would look at it. I mean, everybody's going to define it differently, as Jeff alluded to already. That's a debate you can have and never come up with a definitive answer because it's an unanswerable question, but it's a great discussion.
Yeah.
Bill Malloy was
Yes.
one I enjoyed because it suddenly retroactively puts in that song, which he would be always doing. I'm trying to remember it now.
What can you do with a drunken sailor?
What do you do with a drunken sailor? What do you do with a drunken sailor? What do you do with a drunken sailor early in the morning? It's that type of thing. And so it establishes this thing because you have other characters like, oh yeah, Bill always sang that song. Well, not when we ever saw him, but doesn't mean it wasn't something he always sang. And so it has these little things where the characters could be gone, but they still kept them in as an unseen ghost or spirit, and it worked. And you had other ones as the series goes on that gets in there. Of course, I think probably the best is Quentin.
Yes.
Collins,
Yeah. Yep.
as the most as scary and how David Selby coming in and playing it so well without dialogue, just the body language is amazing. So I think Quentin is probably my favorite ghost. Gerald would be a close second, but
Quentin, Gerard Stiles. Yep. Yeah,
I'll go with the standard and say Sarah, simply because she's such a key to the story. Her existence serves a purpose. She holds a key to the past and is a mystery in the present, and kind of ties it together. So I'll go with the typical answer and say Sarah.
I love Sarah. I just had Sharon Smith-Lentz on the podcast, and it was great chatting with her. She's so nice. And Sarah is definitely a key character. It's a tie for me between Sarah and Quentin. I love Quentin's ghost. He is amazing, like just terrifying, but also he's having a great time. Quentin loves tormenting the living Collins family members, and his sort of puppets David and Amy. It's the whole turn of the screw thing. I loved him as a ghost. Gerard was great too. Very sinister character. Really good stuff. And also kind of, I guess, a different version of a ghost. Revenants, like Jeremiah's ghost. He's more of a revenant. I've heard people call him a zombie. He's not exactly a zombie because he can dematerialize. He can, you can hear his laughter in the room, but you don't see him. But he's a revenant, which is sort of a corporeal ghost that's back for revenge. And Jeremiah was scary looking with the bandages and everything. I think Joanna Mills would also fall into that category, where she's like seems to be living at Collinwood and is part of the interactions with the living characters. And as it turns out, she's a revenant. She's a creature that came back from the grave to get revenge on Samantha Collins, as we find out later. So there's also that kind of subcategory there, I guess, of ghosts. But ghosts are kind of the mainstay, I think, all the way through Dark Shadows, from pre-Barnabas all the way to 1841 parallel time. You got Brutus Collins, Lewis Edmonds with the Shakespearean kind of ruffled collar and the beard, and he was fantastic too. So ghosts seem to be kind of definitely a recurring thing in Dark Shadows. Always cool to see when they do. Some worked better than others, I think, but there were some really good ghost characters that they had in the show. I love Bill Malloy dripping with the seaweed and singing and everything. It was really cool. Yeah.
But only one had the best music.
Quentin, right?
Quentin, yes.
Yes.
Come on. It's just perfect music to go with them.
Perfect. Yes, absolutely. So compelling. Like, it's just eerie, that sad, melancholy gramophone music playing. Fantastic stuff. And of course, that song became a huge hit. Played on the radio and stuff, and to this day, every so often you'll hear it somewhere. So that's really cool. Okay, let's move on here. How about werewolves? Thoughts on? We only had 2 werewolves in the show, Chris Jennings and Quentin Collins. Any thoughts on the werewolves?
I think, and it's, if you talk about an archetype or what we think a werewolf is, it pretty much was original with Lon Chaney Jr. and the Wolfman. I mean, so that's, I believe, at least my iconic thing that I would compare it to. And there's definitely components of that with Chris Jennings.
Yes.
There's they even use the poem from, a version of it. There's a couple of words that are different, but so there's definitely obvious references to that. And I do think that it's interesting in a way. I mean, he's tortured like Lon Chaney Jr., Larry Talbot was, but so is Barnabas, and we see that before. So, and actually, if we talk about vampires or Barnabas, he actually, to me, takes some of the qualities from all of the other sort of archetypes. But werewolf's one of my favorites. I mean, that's great to see them transform, and there's the action, and I I really like how they did that in Dark Shadows.
Great. Steven?
Yeah, I enjoyed the werewolves too. And Chris Jennings' storyline, I think, was my favorite of the two storylines with the werewolf part. And I just like the way he acted. It's like Jeff already said, it's that Lon Chaney Jr. Going back to the Universal parts, which so it feeds into movies that you've seen before, and it keeps that thread, which has that nostalgia factor added into it. So when you're getting introduced to a character for that first time, you're able to relate to him even quicker. But I just like the plight that he had. Quentin, it seemed like we got to. Quentin seemed to have a little. It hits multiple categories of the monsters. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
He is like the Lon Chaney Jr. of Dark Shadows, where he played virtually all the monsters, if you want to work it. And I felt that was always like a little more forced in, as like, oh, we'll make him a monster too because we don't want to have another cast member, so we'll have him do it also. And so it works for me, but it doesn't work as well as the Chris Jennings.
I want to add on to something Steve said. The knowing the character, so you're familiar with the story, but you're like, how is this going to work out for him? How are they going to resolve it for him? And it was wide open that they could have done anything. So I think that's part of the appeal of that. And as far as Quentin being werewolf, it's so funny because that being the age I was, Quentin was the werewolf. He was in the comic books and all of the novels, and really he spent less time, I think, as a werewolf than Chris Jennings. And that was more of a minor plot for him. I'm not saying Chris Jennings should have been the equal to Barnabas in all the stories and everything, but it's just, to me, interesting they latch onto that, that Quentin is the werewolf.
Yeah, it's true. Quentin is more strongly identified as a werewolf, even though he played all these monster archetypes. Ultimately, he ends up as Dorian Gray. He has the painting that keeps him alive and immortal. But he was only a werewolf for a relatively short amount of time. Of course, his legacy as the werewolf is what carries down to Chris Jennings, since it turns out he's his descendant, which I thought was really cool. And it does create a much more sympathetic character. It's absolutely Larry Talbot. Chris Jennings is the analog for Larry Talbot. Through no fault of his own, he bears this curse because of Quentin. Quentin was kind of a bastard. Quentin, I'm not saying anybody deserves to be cursed with lycanthropy, but and this also, the fact that happened did change Quentin's character. He became a more sympathetic character when he's, wake up in the morning and you realize he tore innocent people to shreds as a werewolf. He changed as a character, but prior to that, Quentin was a jerk, and he brought that on himself. So kind of a different take, it kind of diverges from the more sympathetic Larry Talbot portrayal there with Quentin, but we do get the Larry Talbot with Chris Jennings. And sometimes the cast members on the show say, oh, they were played fast and loose with the rules for the supernatural stuff, but I think they stuck pretty closely with a lot of these to the rules that were established by, say, Kurt Siodmak or in the Wolfman script, and Tale Vampire stories and things like that, where Silver Bullet will kill a werewolf. They'll transform during the full moon. And Dark Shadows, it's like the 3 nights of the full moon: the night before the full moon, and the night after the full moon. So you can get 3 episodes of the werewolf. And there, for the most part, it kind of sticks with, it's a curse or hereditary curse, or if you get bitten by a werewolf, Julia mentions that in one episode, and you survive, you can become a werewolf, although it never happened in the show, but it's something that can happen. So they stuck pretty closely, I think, to the lore for that. And then they even brought in Werewolf of London with the moon poppy,
Yeah,
which was really cool, as an attempted cure for Chris's condition. So they brought in a lot of really cool things like that. Of course,
did they ever refer to it on Dark Shadows as werewolfery?
I don't.
They called it in the Werewolf of London, wolfery. I can't even say it.
Werewolfery. I don't think they ever did, but
yeah.
They should have. I want to hear Julia Hoffman say werewolfery.
That sounds like if Bill Malloy would have still been a character at that time, he would have been the one saying it. There's some werewolfery.
Yes. Oh, totally. He is exactly the one who would say it. Or maybe Ben Stokes.
Oh, definitely Ben Stokes.
How about Dark Shadows, of course, is mostly known for, if you're going to pick one monster from Dark Shadows, what it's known for is vampires. Absolutely. Barnabas being an iconic, pop culture icon and became this huge sensation, and sort of the symbol for Dark Shadows, I think Barnabas became. But what about thoughts on vampires on the show? Favorite ones, even in addition to or besides Barnabas, or any thoughts on that?
I love Barnabas as a character, and I think you're talking about archetypes. To my knowledge, that was one of the ones that set up the template for the the beloved from the past being, having somebody in the present being exact look-alike, and they have to seek out that love, which was then done. It seemed like in every Dracula movie afterwards. And Barnabas, of course, was not Dracula, but it was just. And I think the other writers were like, "Oh, that's gold," because that's something you could. You obviously have the dynamic storytelling to go in. You can make love triangles. You can have that hold that thing with the past. And I mean, they did it before in movies, in the past. I just remember
The
like
Mummy.
the universe, the Mummies movies. But this was the first time with the vampire and with Dracula, or in this case, Barnabas. And I really appreciate that. It was a game changer that Dane Curtis and the writers were able to bring in and do it. But it was he was an interesting character because, again, evil, and then we find that he's more complex and all these other things going on. And as you develop, you start to appreciate and understand where he's coming from, which I think is an undertone with a lot of the characters, as we said, with David and so on, that they start off as the bad guy, which kind of reminds me, and I know Jeff is big into this too. I'm sure you are, Danielle, with comic books where they always have certain villains that take off and then they become the anti-hero.
Yeah. Oh,
and
totally.
and Barnabas was in that, was just ahead of that curve on some of them, because it was after him when you had anti-heroes like the Punisher, and it was years later you had anti-heroes like Venom and so on. But I'm sure there are ones at that time and prior. But I'm just thinking the ones that most audience people will understand and know.
Yeah. Scarlet Witch. I mean, I've compared Barnabas to the Punisher before, actually, on the podcast. He does follow that kind of path where he becomes an anti-hero. Absolutely. Jeff, any thoughts on vampires and Dark Shadows or Barnabas?
Yeah, I'll go beyond Barnabas. They talk about a lot of ghosts being on there. There were a fair number of vampires too, and that's the interesting thing because it can spread.
Hmm.
Barnabas is the vampire, but who will he turn? And other characters popping up, and it seems like the first time one of those different characters bears their fangs, like, oh my gosh, they turned, they're a vampire. So I think I love anytime there's a new vampire revealed, and sometimes it's not a surprise. I'm not real sure if it ever is really a complete surprise, but uh, yeah, I love that aspect, not just with Barnabas, but how it goes through the whole show.
Yeah, it does become a thread through the show. For a while, it's Barnabas. Barnabas is the vampire, but yeah, then you start adding. I think maybe Vampire Angelique might have been the first other vampire, and then we get Tom Jennings, um, played by Don Briscoe, the twin brother of Chris Jennings. And then in 1897 too, we get Dirk Wilkins, kind of a crazy vampire, like a kind of wild kind of vampire. You got quite a few Roxanne later on, Megan Todd. You wind up seeing quite a few vampires in the show. What Barnabas kind of at the center of all of that. And I agree, Stephen, Barnabas really, prior to that, you did have that trope with in the Mummy, but Dark Shadows kind of pull that in to Barnabas along with the sort of sympathetic aspect of Larry Talbot and the Dracula aspect as well, and kind of merged all of those things together into this new yet familiar kind of archetype that it created in the show. And vampires after that, you did see, like, even up to Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, they did that bit with the look-alike there. So it certainly had an impact in that regard. And again, Vampires and Dark Shadows I think follow a lot of what we know of as sort of the gothic horror tropes for vampires. They can't exist in the sunlight. They will have to be in their coffin by the sunrise. They can turn into bats. They drink blood. They have supernatural abilities like hypnotism. They can dominate somebody's will. They can turn somebody else into a vampire. They have supernatural strength, although which is not often shown with Barnabas, but we do see it sometimes. I mean, he has the one-handed death grip strangulation thing that he does, and I know there's one episode where the bars in Dr. Woodard's office were bent like pipe cleaners because he wanted to get to the you didn't see him do it, but you saw the aftermath of that. So there were hints as to Barnabas's supernatural strength in the show. He could dematerialize. So I think a lot of cross, he was vulnerable to the cross. There were a lot of things that we were very familiar with from things like Hammer films and Universal horror films that and Bram Stoker, etc., that made their way into Dark Shadows. Um, even Barnabas's whole look with the cape, the Inverness cape, the black cape and everything. I mean, it's just like you look at Barnabas and like vampire. I mean, it's just they didn't say the word vampire for like, I don't know, Jeff, when you were watching as a kid. Well, you started watching during the werewolf storyline, so Barnabas was already established. But I wonder, I assume most people watching, even before they said the word vampire or Barnabas bit anybody and you saw his fangs in those first couple of weeks, you must have known right away, like this is going to be a vampire. Because he comes out of the coffin and he's wearing the black cape. It's just all the visual cues are there, you know?
One thing about vampires too on Dark Shadows, they're always to me very scary.
Yes.
Speaking of Tom Jennings, and I watched this one episode because it does have references to Horror of Dracula from Hammer, but that Tom Jennings in that is a maniac. I mean, I've never seen a vampire act like he does when he's about to bite Vicky in her bedroom. So I don't know, something about him. And him peering in the window, that even kind of reminded me of Salem's Lot a little bit.
Yeah.
But they're scary. And I got to say the Hammer things because I think they're just great. I mean, when Joe comes to Nicholas Blair's and meets Angelique for the first time, it's very similar to one of the vampire brides meeting Jonathan Harker. She kind of, acts like a damsel in distress. And then before you know it, she's biting him. And then Barnabas grabs two candlesticks and forms a cross. That is just amazing. And that's so interesting that a vampire himself would do that.
Yeah.
I don't remember if he was a vampire at the
Well, he
time.
wasn't anymore at that point because
Okay.
the experiment
could he
with
have done
Adam.
it if he was a vampire? I don't know.
I don't know. He would have been like, ow.
And also, I'm really curious. You asked a good question, Danielle. What were people at the time who were watching it live for the first time? What did they, was it like today where there's gossip in the TV guide or the newspaper or something? And I know it's not like today, but did people have any clue or warning that it was coming, or would the only thing would know about it would be what they saw when it happened?
I think some of the magazines, once Dark Shadows got really popular, I know like 16 magazine and stuff like that would sometimes throw in like little tidbits of the gossip that they heard of things that were coming up, but it was only very like little tidbits, like, so I don't know outside of that. I'm not sure what
And that was probably later after the success, but when you first learned that Barnabas is a vampire, wouldn't you love to have like witnessed that for the first time and been surprised?
Yeah, because I went in knowing he was a vampire. Thanks to my uncle, very similar to Steven with his older brother. My uncle Valdemar, he's not that much older than I am. He's maybe like 15 years older than I am. So he was more like an older brother, honestly, and still is to this day, than an uncle. Like he was cool. He would give me his famous Monsters of Filmland magazines, and he would tell me enthusiastically stories about Dark Shadows and about all of that stuff. So I knew going in immediately that Barnabas was a vampire, but it would have been cool to see that for the first time, not knowing what was coming, how shocking that must have been when you see that pale hand come out of the coffin and grab Willie by the throat. Of course, kids started running home from school because I'm sure there's a vampire on TV, the kids were running home to see that. And this was, the monster craze was going on too. So you had to see this stuff every day on TV. It's amazing. And Dan Curtis himself was a fan of all this stuff. So he was clearly, I think, we had the writers. The writers were brilliant. These playwrights that were writing and these great theater actors. But I think Dan Curtis's spirit, his enthusiasm for that stuff was feeding into it. In fact, he talks in one of those interviews about You could just see him light up talking about the equipment in the lab for the Frankenstein storyline they did, which brings me to our next set of man-made monsters. I guess we'll call them the Frankenstein monster analog Adam and the Bride of Frankenstein analog Eve. Any thoughts on Adam and Eve?
I really enjoyed the storyline, and I thought, like I said earlier, it was one that should have been continued on even more. It kind of just ends. I wish or they could have went back to it. Now, it's hard for me to say whether it was because actor contracts, other things. Maybe somebody was going on to do some kind of production and couldn't do the show.
I can tell you what happened. Robert Rodan, who played Adam, this is supposedly what happened according to him. He asked Dan Curtis for more money, and Dan Curtis said goodbye. Don't
There
ask
you
Dan
go.
Curtis for more money. That's the lesson.
Always comes down to the money.
Mhm.
It's like everybody wants it, but so there you go. That's what a storyline. Well, you could. The sad thing is, being that it was a man-made monster, all they had to do was have somebody throw acid on the face, and the doctor could have regrafted a new face, and ergo, you have a new actor.
Oh, there you go.
It was a simple solution to it, and they could have continued the storylines and going on, and then you could, that's something where once you establish that fact, then you can have a whole bunch of things go down where you can have different people play different things and go through with it. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a good take. It was just, I think, a little underutilized for my taste. I thought it could have been fleshed out more. Now it sounds like, obviously, I know why it was abruptly ended, but I felt it could have been done more effectively.
I get your point, Steve, and I love my Dark Shadows, but to me, this was one of the longest, most drawn out storylines, and then right into the Dream Curse. Those are the ones to me that just go on a little too long, and it's hard to rewatch those for me anyway. But what I like about the Frankenstein storyline is the sort of the difference with Eve, that she is the reincarnation, or she's possessed, and so she comes up smart and ready to go. And I think she doesn't reject Adam at first, does she? Doesn't she like first sort of embrace him, but then a few episodes later is when she rejects him? And I don't remember if she like leads him into thinking that she's
I think it's
still
more that she leads him into thinking that
okay.
it's not so much that I don't think she ever really had much interest in Adam. She found him kind of dull. And she was possessed by the spirit of Danielle Roget, the most evil
Right.
woman who ever lived, so but yeah, I thought she was great. Marie Wallace, yeah.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah.
And Jeff, later on when we're doing a different thing, you and I are going to have some talking about the dream thing and all this other stuff, because I enjoy those things. So
The
obviously,
Dream Curse.
I enjoy them as well. They just are a little repetitive and a little long.
I love any storyline in Dark
Yeah.
Shadows. Bring it up. If it's Dark Shadows, I'm in. But but Adam, I mean, I think calling Adam a monster, he's a monster in that he was created from body parts and brought to life, but he becomes monstrous because of how, just like the Frankenstein monster, because of how everyone else treats him. Everyone else is more of a monster. Dr. Lang, or who doesn't really get to meet Dr. Lang, but even Barnabas and Julia and Willie don't treat him very well. And then he falls under the sway of Nicholas Blair, the warlock, who has a malignant sort of influence on him. But he becomes monstrous because of how he is treated. And these characters are all these classic horror characters are these cursed, tormented beings there's a pathos to them, like the Frankenstein monster and Adam, or the werewolf, the Larry Talbot. Even Dracula, he says that line, to be, what is the line? I even might have even written, to die, to be really dead. That must be glorious. There's even a hint of that with Dracula, who's probably of those characters is certainly the least sympathetic, but I felt I remember watching that as a kid, and Adam being sad and alone in that cell and crying and stuff. And my heart went out to Adam, but then he becomes not very nice. And a lot of it's like he echoes a lot of Barnabas's personality traits too, that sort of demanding and impulsive and driven by passion. Adam is like that. And I loved Eve too, Marie Wallace, very different take on the Bride of Frankenstein. As Jeff pointed out, it isn't the mute hissing. I love Elsa Lanchester. I wish she had been in the movie more, but like the bride in the film, she rejects Adam, but she's a much more fully fleshed out character, and you see her over the course of several episodes, played by Marie Wallace. So really interesting. I know a lot. The Adam and Eve storyline isn't for everybody. A lot of people are not huge fans of it. I dig it. I think it's cool. I would have liked a more satisfactory ending for it, or bring Adam back years later. Like, what happened? How did the life force get severed between Adam and Barnabas? Does Adam come back to get revenge? Like, or does he need something? Like, I would have liked to have seen him come back again.
One thing I wanted to bring up when you said, whether you consider Adam a monster or not, because he doesn't really do monstrous things till later. Again, it's my definition of monster, which Jeff said you're going to be weary when you ask this question early on. But I look at, because like Mighty Joe Young, it was always considered, it's like considered a monster movie. And Mighty Joe Young is never malicious or evil, is always trying to help out. But yeah, I still consider him a monster because it falls into the beyond the normal standard of what we have in nature. And Adam would fall that same way, even if his actions are altruistic. He's still a monster. But just because they're monsters, I think a lot of people stigmatize them as automatically thinking they have to do bad things, which some people refer to as monstrous. And I'm standing up for monsters in society. Just because you are a monster doesn't necessarily mean you're evil. You could be the nicest monster in the world. And I think people should stop judging people by their looks and appearances and how they identify, whether they identify as a monster or not, and realize it's what's inside of you that matters.
That's right. Well, Sigmund, the sea monster.
I need a tissue.
That's I'm just cutting in here real quick because Steven hit on something very important with regard to Dark Shadows and why it appealed so much to adolescents, to children, to marginalized people, to people who felt like outsiders. Dark Shadows hit at just the right time when the counterculture was happening in the 60s, going into the 70s. I mean, there was massive resonance with a lot of people who connected with this idea of the other having depth, having complexity, and becoming ultimately the protagonists of the show. And I think that was not only important to the success of Dark Shadows, but had a massive impact on subsequent pop culture depictions of these types of characters, especially in an ongoing story, like in a television series.
And I talked about Eve, how that was different. Well, Adam too, they both, the storylines go beyond what we generally know about the Frankenstein story. And usually there's exceptions, but he doesn't usually advance as far and become like a fully functioning human being. So it's a nice little what if.
Yeah.
What if Dan Curtis would have paid him the extra money to bring him back to resolve the storylines? We'll never know.
We'll never know. They could have used him in, I was surprised when Big Finish, they did a story with Robert Rodan, and he played a revenant, and then he played a Oswald Gravener, who's a sea captain, and they could have done an Adam thing with him, and they didn't. I don't know why they didn't bring him back to do Adam, since they had access to him. But oh well. Maybe if there's ever a sequel show, we'll have somebody else. We'll recast Adam and have the new face like Steven suggested there. That'd be interesting. Moving on, witches and warlocks. Any thoughts on witches? Dark Shadows, of course, famously had Angelique, and we have Nicholas Blair, and we have Judah Zachary, the head of Judah Zachary, and witchcraft going on. So, any thoughts on the witches and warlocks of Dark Shadows?
I think it's the warlocks that are most interesting. That's not too common. I mean, we don't really see a lot about warlocks, and that. I would say probably I wasn't even really familiar with what a warlock was, and so my impression is from Dark Shadows and Nicholas Blair, and as far as witches, I mean, Angelique's the talk about an archetype. To me, she's like an archetypal witch that others are based on.
Yeah,
my knowledge of witches going into this when I was growing up would be from Bewitched, which you used a reference to at the very beginning of this with Dr. Bombay, help me. I'm sick. And and of course in there they had witches and warlocks, and so when I go to watch Dark Shadows with my elder brother, and those scenes, it just felt natural, and really when you look at Angelique, she is the evil version of Elizabeth Montgomery's character from Bewitched when you're watching those things like I was. So it's just like, okay, so this is the good one. This is if everything went bad, like the mirror image, the mirror verse. But to go back to the warlocks, I also consider Count
Count Patofi with the hand, yeah.
Yeah, I consider him to be a warlock too.
I always thought of him more as like a wizard or a mage, because he's has no affiliation with Satan, but
to me, it's like wizards, mages, warlock. I don't know. It's kind of all, they're all doing something in that same area. They're all in the arena.
Yeah.
But would you consider them monsters?
Ah, yes.
Just kidding.
They kind of in Dark Shadows. I did an episode on witches and warlocks and mages with Laramie Dean, and we talked about how in Dark Shadows, like in a lot of classic horror films where you do have witches, not that there are a ton of them, but there, several, there's a pact perhaps with a diabolic force, but once that happens, they seem to become less and less human over time. Like Angelique comes back from the dead how many times? And they become something beyond human, like Princess Aza in Black Sunday, for example, or Helena Marcos and Suspiria. There's something inhuman about them, and they have these magical abilities that are derived from diabolic forces, from Diabolos in Dark Shadows, or the devil. They're getting these satanic infused powers, but they themselves in the process become something less than human or more than human, I guess, depending on how you look at it. So I would consider them, I'd put them in the monstrous category, the monster category.
Yeah, Jeff, what Penny said. Take that.
And witches are, in a way, yes, I think they're monsters, but maybe not on the same level. But they've really got the most potential to do. They can do almost anything with their, magical powers. Vampire, really, we talked about what he can do in the werewolf. But a witch, it's like the world is her oyster. They can cast all kinds of spells and do all kinds of damage.
Because without Angelique, we wouldn't have Barnabas as a vampire. So I mean, it's obviously, so you can look at it, who's more powerful. Well, one begot the other. So. But then again, can the pupil pass the teacher? Who knows? With that, but I love the way that these characters were utilized in different ways. Sometimes they're with each other, sometimes they're against each other, and I think that's really good. And some of them, there's a little power structure when they're introduced, like who's in charge, who's not in charge, and it fluctuates depending on how bad of a job they're doing, which would be how good of a job they're doing. But if you get what I'm using, how evil they are at that particular time.
And then you got to bring in, it's like who's worse, the witch or the witch hunter in Dark Shadows? Because you have Reverend Trask, who's, talk about somebody who's maybe not a monster, but monstrous in the way that kind of David is. He's with the original Reverend Trask, he's fanatical. He's and it turned out he was kind of right. He was just after the wrong person. It was Vicky was the wrong target there. But then when his ghost comes back, it's kind of fun that he goes after Angelique or Cassandra. And then you have Gregory Trask, his descendant in 1897, who's a real hypocrite. He's total hypocrite, very monstrous character. But back to kind of supernatural characters here.
One thing I want to add to Reverend Trask, to me, would be the religious Punisher of his day.
Yeah. Yes. If he was after the correct person, maybe people would feel differently about Reverend Trask. If he locked onto Angelique and like, oh, she's the witch. Zombies. What about zombies? Dark Shadows did feature zombies. Now we talked about sort of going into the 70s and how we were transitioning from the Gothic into other versions of horror, more risque or lurid horror. It makes me kind of sad because I love the old school zombies, like that zombies that we see in films like I Walked with a Zombie or I'm wearing my Plague of the Zombies t-shirt that was designed by the amazing Donnie David. Dark Shadows zombies were more like the Plague of the Zombies or White Zombie or I Walked with a Zombie type zombies. They were undead, beings that were raised by somebody who had magic, usually a witch or some sorcerer that would bring them back from the dead and control them. They were not flesh-eating ghouls, or Romero, that happened when George Romero created these flesh-eating ghouls for Night of the Living Dead. That is a different thing than what we're seeing in Dark Shadows. We're seeing more old school classic zombies in Dark Shadows. Any thoughts on the zombies of Dark Shadows?
That's one of the greatest images, is just, the ground pulsating in a hand
Yeah.
plunging up into the air. I love that. I love the take on the zombies. And I mean, that's probably at the time the only kind of take they would have. I mean, Life of the Living Dead came out in 68, but I don't know if it like had immediate appeal or if it just kind of grew. But I love that you said Plague of the Zombies. That is, on a certain days, my favorite Hammer movie, and I just love the treatment, and that is what it's like in Dark Shadows. They're servants, and I think I love how they treated them.
I concur with Jeff. I agree with him because my favorite type of zombie movies are the classic zombie, the voodoo zombie. Those are the ones that gravitate towards the most. I enjoy the flesh-eating zombies, but not as much, because I don't think there's as many storylines as you can do. They've come up a lot of them, but they all seem to kind of follow the same thing, where they're overtaking humanity, and how's humanity going to fight them off, or you have to keep them from overtaking. Where with the classic voodoo zombies, you have the zombie master and other things, and they're usually set up on a task or a goal. And what goal are they trying to do? What task are they trying to do? Are they going to be able to speak or not speak? There's so many different factors, and depending on the magic that's bringing them back, or what is going on, you can have some different aspects that you can play storyline wise with. So I think there's more possibilities, storylines, with the classic zombies than there are with the more modern zombies. But that could just be me, or just the ones I've experienced.
It's interesting you said voodoo. I know Angelique has like history in voodoo, and I don't know if that was so much in the show as in like her book, but were any of the zombies actually connected to voodoo, or were they just raised by people that had the power to do that?
For sure, when Quentin was a zombie,
Oh, okay.
yet another monster. When Angelique was the one who raised him as a zombie, but Barnabas references a lot of voodoo traditions when he was in the West Indies, and how to summon a zombie back to its grave, and by burning these certain spices. And they talk about some of the powers of the zombie, that zombies are very powerful, and that they referenced some of the voodoo stuff during that storyline, as I recall. But it wasn't like heavy. It wasn't like heavily steeped in it. It was just kind of like tying it into it, but not overly stating it, I guess. But yeah, Quentin was a zombie for a little while. I remember him carrying Rachel Drummond into the mist in the graveyard and stuff. I love that kind of imagery. I am not so much a big fan of the flesh-eating zombies. I find that very, it's kind of disgusting. It repulses me. I'm like, why do they eat? Why do they want to even eat people? Go to McDonald's. Like, if you why like, I don't know. I still don't get that. Like, why?
You don't know what's in those chicken nuggets.
Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's what Johnny Depp did when he came back. He went to McDonald's, right?
oh gosh.
Sorry. I
Mephistopheles.
did want to bring that up because I know it's often referenced, and I don't have any differing opinion, but those first few minutes that recreate are fantastic.
Agree.
And I just want that put out there, because people look at the movie as a whole, and I would be happy if that was a short film and that's all that there was to it, but I just had to say that.
No, I agree with you. I think that, and everybody says that, and I completely agree. The beginning of the film is atmospheric, and it's not comedic, and it's cool and spooky, and you see the train coming, and even Nights in White Satin playing. Like, I don't normally go for, songs, pop songs in Dark Shadows, but it worked. It was atmospheric. But then as soon as Barnabas comes back in the present day, then it's the fish out of water stuff, and it just goes off Widow's Hill, in my opinion, at that point. I liked some of the visuals, as with all Tim Burton films. It's visually very stunning. The house, they went to great effort to make the house have that sort of silhouette of Seaview Terrace. It's a little different, but it has that. You look at it, it's like, oh, yeah, that's Collinwood. They even give Barnabas the bangs, which even Ben Cross didn't have the bangs. So, I mean, they overdid the bangs, I thought, with Johnny Depp. But hey, that's Barnabas's hairstyle. He has the Barna bangs. So there were, there were some things I liked, but we'll see if anything new comes along that will be done seriously with the Gothic style in it. I want to touch on a couple more monster types here. We had Mr. Hyde in Dark Shadows with John Yeager, Dr. Cyrus Longworth, and John Yeager. Any thoughts on that?
I don't remember the characteristics of like Henry Jekyll. It seems like Cyrus is really meek
Yeah,
and at the beginning, and I don't remember Jekyll. He seemed usually more confident, and so I think that was a little bit different, maybe. And I just want to say, Christopher Pennock was like
oh,
amazing.
yes,
He was
yeah,
so good. I forget that, and then episodes after that where he plays the different characters, he's always good, and so just want to throw that out there.
yeah.
But I like it, and they, to a certain extent, bring in some of the lesser characters. The Dr. Lanyon comparison
Oh,
would
right,
be,
yeah.
and but that's even a little bit different. Um, but I really liked how they treated that. Steve, what do you think?
I enjoyed it. I mean, as you said, I love Christopher Pennock, and I thought he was a breath of fresh air when they brought him in. I just like a lot of the roles that he did.
Yeah.
A couple, not like a lot. He did he did a few. I would have wondered if the storyline would have been interesting to me if Dr. Hoffman would have been the doctor and what she would have turned into as a job. I would have loved to have seen her have a chance to. She was taking the serum, trying to find something to cure Barnabas back in the day, and then that transformed her into something else.
Yeah.
Because she's such a great actress, I would have been like Grayson Hall. I would have been curious to see her have that dual role, and
Yeah.
I would have wondered where it would have went and how that would have happened. So that could have been something they might have done in the future plot thing, because obviously, like we said, in 5 years, it would have been they repeated people doing different ones. Obviously, eventually, Quentin would have drank the formula just because Quentin became every monster practically over time. I'm sure he would have went into magic and became a warlock as
And the
the things went
vampire.
along.
He has to take a turn with every monster. Yeah,
Yes.
that would have been interesting. Julia as a Hyde version of Julia. Well, I guess we had Hoffman, who was the Mrs. Danvers in parallel time, the evil Julia, I guess. But that would have been interesting seeing a Hyde Julia. She was kind of a mad scientist. Well, I don't know, mad, but was certainly obsessed with Barnabas and finding a cure for Barnabas initially, too. And she's in that territory. I don't know to the degree that, say, Dr. Lang is definitely mad scientist territory. Julia's more calm, but she's obsessive. She has an obsessive streak. And Longworth, Dr. Longworth, yes, he was meek. It was when he was Longworth, but he, like in the Stevenson novella and in the film versions, he's like sort of, this becomes like an escape for him. He escapes into Jaeger, and Jaeger is, I think, a very accurate Hyde. Hyde is a monster. He is talk about a monster. He is pure id, just absolutely no empathy. He delights in doing horrible things. But who are you going to get to play that but Christopher Pennock? He brought that frenetic kind of energy to the show, and I thought he was very good as Jaeger. Definitely a love to hate him kind of character. A lot of people really hate Jaeger because he's off, especially to what he does to Buffy Harrington, who's the analog for Ivy.
Right.
And he's really horrible to her, but he's Hyde. He's a horrible creature. And in fact, they even pulled from the novella, Stevenson novella, when he's Jaeger, when you're in Jaeger's presence, he almost warps the atmosphere in the room. You can sense the evil coming from him. There's something unnatural about him. I thought it was pretty well done with him. Now we have a few other monsters that were kind of. I'm just gonna name some, and if anybody has thoughts on these, because we're gonna be wrapping it up soon. We have the Phoenix, which was a very unique creature created for Dark Shadows. We have the Leviathan monster, which was a Lovecraftian inspired creature we never saw on screen. We have the shadow that was cast upon Jeb Hawks, the pursuing shadow that's trying to consume him. I mentioned mad scientist. I don't know if that would count as monsters, but anybody have thoughts on any of those archetypes or monsters that I've just referenced?
Well, I enjoyed the Phoenix because, again, that was where it was starting to get to the supernatural elements, because you had the Josette and then you had the Phoenix showing up, which it then, of course, tied directly into David, as we talked about earlier. So I really enjoyed how that was done and how it was like, this mother's love and everything else, and how he was being torn between two worlds, which set him up to be, I could sympathize with David a little bit. Like I said, I never really cared for the character because he was always, I know they tried to, basically, they started off so evil for me, but I can understand he was so traumatized. And this would have been an incident that even any normal child would have been totally going to see a psychiatrist for the rest of their life, as it goes through. And I appreciate that storyline, because that storyline helped set up the future where it was going to go, oh, Supernatural's working, ratings are improving, let's go this direction. And so without that storyline, you don't have, it would have ended in one season.
I don't think of the ones you mentioned. There's a couple. I did a little bit of research and saw some specific movies that Dark Shadows references. So if I can kind of throw that in here, maybe.
Yeah, please do.
Due to Zachary's head, there's a movie called The Thing That Couldn't Die.
Yes, yep.
Very much the same thing. They uncover a head and he possesses people. I've read that, and I'm not as familiar with the Roxanne Drew storyline, but that kind of echoes some Carmilla.
Yes. Yep.
With the female stalking another female. Rosemary's Baby references with the Leviathan baby. It seems like there's... Oh, and then the maybe just a hint of it, and maybe you can tell me if it's more deep than that, but Faust with Charles Delaware Tate and the deal he made with... So I think those are fun movie references.
Absolutely, yeah. Good call outs there for sure. He makes a Faustian bargain with Petofi to get those powers for sure. Yeah. Dark Shadows pulled from so many classic stories and from films, and the ones you called out for sure. Excellent picks there. I want to talk about the Phoenix briefly. The Phoenix is, even though Dark Shadows was pulling from all of these different stories and films, the Phoenix was a very unique thing that they came up with. It's certainly is based on the mythological phoenix from Greek mythology that burns up in its nest every 100 years and rises from its own ashes. That is certainly the basis, but this is the only time I've ever seen a humanoid undead creature that is a phoenix. They took this myth and turned it into a monster on the show, and I have never seen that. The only thing I could think of that had some similarities was Aisha and She and the H. Rider Haggard story, but it's not exactly. There's a little echo there, but that's a very unique thing that they did in Dark Shadows.
Oh, I agree, and it definitely was going deep into mythology, which makes you wonder what if they would have dug deeper for some other things. What else could they have brought out? I guess some of the stuff they couldn't, because they were looking at the budget and the effects that they had at certain levels, and this was something that they could take and port over economically, and it ended up working. So I think, but it would have been interesting to see if they would have gone more into the various mythologies that were out there and to try to get some different, like the sirens. They could have had them play in a role, and that could have been something that would have been not as special effects heavy, but the singing, making people go, like maybe trying to drive certain characters to go off the cliff. So there's things that could have happened down the road with their certain writing. What do you think, Jeff?
No, I agree. I'd never really thought about that before. I always find it a little strange that that's like the first kind of supernatural thing that they went with, but it is original. They took something, they didn't take the vampire and do something really different with it. It's sort of the same thing. So that, and I do wonder what else could they have done? And they, if they had taken that route, throughout, just sort of making their own out of bits and pieces, that would have been, never have been as successful, but it's definitely an interesting approach.
For sure, yeah. And you mentioned the budget and not being able to do certain things. The Leviathan monster definitely comes to mind there because we had, a lot. They worked H.P. Lovecraft into Dark Shadows, which is bananas. It's insane that they did that, but it's really cool that they attempted to do that. But of course, they never showed what it looks like, when Jeb Hawks is in his true form. And there's part of me, like the little kid in me, is always still wishes I could have seen what it looked like just for a second, but it's probably for the best that they did not attempt to show us what it looked like.
I kind of like that they didn't show it. And this, I watched this episode the other day. The sound, with it really contributes to you sort of painting your own picture of what it's like, and then the reaction of someone that sees it. I don't mind how they did that. You're right. I don't, they shouldn't have attempted it.
Yeah. Leaves it to the imagination.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was about to say the same thing Jeff did, because when you read Lovecraft, you always say it's unspeakable horror.
Yes.
It's unimaginable.
Yes.
And every time we've seen a Lovecraft story where they try to imagine the unimaginable, almost always we're left wanting. It's like, oh, you could have did this better, that better. So the music and everything, as Jeff already put the rest of it so well, works. I just think it was an impossible job to do with any chance with the budget they had of pulling off something that anybody would care about or think fondly of. So I think they're better to less is more is always the standard to go by when you have a small budget. And I think they pulled that off rather well with the music and the acting that they had going into it.
Yeah.
They could have used a frog like they did in The Maze.
They didn't have the budget for a frog.
Yeah.
Are there any horror stories or archetypes that you guys would have liked to have seen in Dark Shadows that they didn't use?
The Phantom of the Opera.
Oh, that would have been interesting. Yeah.
Was that I'm trying to think of ones they could do and pull off with the budget they had. And the Phantom would be one. And they did it with zombies, with the voodoo zombies. And you could say the Mummy, but it would have been roughly the same story arcs. It would have been underneath somebody's control. So you could have had it, but it would have been the makeup with putting the wraps on them. I think they did better with just using the old school zombies. I don't think that would work as well. What about you, Jeff?
Well, I've been thinking about this because this also is a question usually. And since Steve is on, Danielle, I don't know if you realize, but this is just for him. Why couldn't out of the ocean rise the kaiju Godzilla? I know it's not very gothic, but
Godzilla stomps on Collinwood.
Steve, what do you think of that?
Well, again, it goes with the budget.
Oh, you'd never see it. That's the thing. You just would have to imagine.
You just hear the sound?
Yeah.
That would be the last episode. That would be your last image, blinding light. You hear the roar and the blinding light, and it's all done.
End of the scene. So I think combining Godzilla with like vampires and ghosts, it just doesn't seem to work.
Godzilla met Bambi. I mean,
that's true. We saw how that ended.
Yeah,
that was also just as quick. But going with Lovecraft, with Lovecraft, Innsmouth, the fish type people, and you can have them in various forms. And of course, Dark Shadows being at the water, that could have been something that could have been tied into, possibly, and that would have, and they probably could have pulled it off, effects wise, with the makeup and everything. If they didn't do like the full body prosthetics, or maybe only had one to show like what they look like at their final thing, it's something I think they could have pulled off. So I think that could have worked. So
what about did Dark Shadows ever do a monkey or an ape?
No.
Murders in the Rue Morgue.
No, that would have been interesting. No, they never did do that. No, that would have been interesting too. It is surprising they didn't do more like ocean-based supernatural stuff because it is a coastal town and they had the widows at the Widow's Hill on the cliff, but they didn't have too much in terms of like nautical horrors, like a Rime of the Ancient Mariner kind of a deal. They never really did anything like that, which I was surprised by. Great discussion, guys. I really enjoyed hearing from both of you. Really insightful thoughts, and it was really fun hearing what you had to say. Do you have any closing thoughts on any of these monstrous characters here?
No, I mean, I think we said it all. I mean,
okay.
Yeah,
awesome.
Full of monstrous characters. That's what we love. At least what I love about Dark Shadows, one of the things. And I love different takes on classic characters or monsters. And so it's always fun to see what they do with all of them.
Yeah, I enjoyed their spin on the various archetypes. Some of them they stayed very close to, like we talked about with Chris Jennings and Barnabas for the most part. But then they also came up with new spins that were taken, or they developed intellectual properties that weren't really being utilized at all with the Phoenix. And so I like that they were taking chances with certain properties and then expanding on the realm with other properties. And even though they didn't show us the H.P. Lovecraft type stuff, I know a lot of people don't like the Leviathan storyline, but I enjoyed the storyline because people, if you keep throwing out the same stuff over and over, then eventually it gets stale. And so you always want to see things taken in a new direction. It doesn't always mean it's going to work, but you always want to show that it's taking chances, or a movie series or whatever. So you want to see things that are new. And if it doesn't work, well, the great thing about a soap opera is that, that storyline doesn't work. Well, a few months later, it's going to alter because the next storyline is going to come into place. And if it does work, they're going to extend it. So there's always that new thing coming in or being interwoven. As the one storyline ends, the next one is coming into play. So I appreciate this walk down looking at the different archetypes, because sometimes people forget and just remember only Barnabas and the werewolf and Angelique, and that's it. That's the general people are only going to remember those three as the witch, the vampire, and the werewolf. It's almost like it's a C.S. Lewis type book,
or they walked into a bar.
Well, what bar would they walk into, Jeff?
The Blue Whale.
Of course.
They'd all be dancing, and then Godzilla would show up, and that's it. With Bill Malloy riding on the
Bill Malloy riding Godzilla. Yeah. Okay, I need to see fan art of somebody needs to draw the ghost of Bill Malloy dripping with seaweed riding on Godzilla. Send that to me, and I'll show it in the next episode. All right, folks. Well, please do check out the Classic Horrors Club podcast and the Classic Horrors Club website. And also please check out the DieCast Movie Podcast. So many great episodes await you if you have not been listening to it. And if you have been listening to it, you know what I'm talking about. It's good stuff. So please go check it out. And guys, thank you again for joining me. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and I'm glad we finally got to do this.
Pleasure was all mine. Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again for having me on. And also, listeners, my podcast, it's audio only, so you don't have to see this face. It's all audio, so you can just imagine something better.
I'm so happy that you not only showed your face, but in front of the old house on top of it. So, I see the sun is setting. You gotta get out of there, Steven. I can already hear the dogs. Oh, you gotta get out. Get out. Thank you for listening. And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.